You know, in the early 20th century, a war broke out in Europe that would literally change everything. It was called the Great War, and it would completely redefine America's role on the world stage. So how on earth did it all kick off?
And that's really the big question we're going to tackle here. It's an incredible story about tangled alliances and massive ambitions that just spiraled out of control, eventually dragging a very reluctant United States right into the middle of it all. All right, so to really get this, you got to picture what Europe was like before the war. It was anything but peaceful. It was, for all intents and purposes, a giant tinderbox, just waiting for a match.
And you know what's kind of handy? Historians have boiled down all these complicated causes into a simple acronym, MAIN. That stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. These four huge forces were just shoving Europe closer and closer to the edge.
So let's start with A for alliances. The best way to think about it is like a series of tripwires crisscrossing the entire continent. All these countries made secret pacts to defend each other, and it basically created two enormous, heavily armed camps. You had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, staring down the Triple Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia.
And wow, this map from 1914 really paints a picture, doesn't it? You can see just how starkly the continent was divided. The Central Powers, there in red, are smacked right in the middle of Europe, pretty much surrounded by the Allied powers in green. You can just feel the tension. A fight between any two of these nations was almost guaranteed to pull everybody else in.
Okay, next up in our MAIN acronym, I for imperialism. This was basically a global scramble for colonies, for resources, for power. All the big European nations were in this fierce competition to build these massive overseas empires, and they started seeing each other as obstacles to their grand ambitions.
I mean, just look at this map. It really puts the scale of this whole thing into perspective. By 1914, just a handful of European countries controlled huge chunks of the planet. And all that competition abroad created these deep, bitter rivalries that would eventually explode back home in Europe.
And then you get the spark, the single moment that lit the whole tinderbox. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a guy named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was shot and killed in Sarajevo. And what happened next was like dominoes falling in fast motion. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, Russia backed up Serbia, Germany backed up Austria-Hungary, and that whole web of alliances we just talked about, it went off. The tripwires were hit, and the entire continent was plunged into war.
So everyone thought, oh, this will be a quick war, be home by Christmas. Yeah, that was not the case. The fighting on the Western Front just devolved into this horrible, grinding stalemate. Both sides dug hundreds and hundreds of miles of trenches, and for 4 long, miserable years, millions of men lived and died in the mud, sometimes fighting for just a few feet of ground.
And if you want to understand just how brutal this new kind of warfare was, get a load of this number, 19,000. That's how many British soldiers were killed on the very first day of just one battle, the Battle of the Somme. It was industrial-scale killing like the world had never, ever seen before.
So you're probably wondering, while Europe is tearing itself to pieces, where is the United States in all this? Well, for a long time, America was just watching from the sidelines, absolutely determined to stay out of it.
In fact, President Woodrow Wilson won his re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The official U.S. position was total neutrality. And that was super popular. Most Americans felt like, hey, this is Europe's fight, not ours.
But was America really neutral? This chart here tells a very different story. If you follow the money, you'll see American banks and factories were selling a ton of supplies to the Allies, especially to Great Britain. By 1916, we're talking billions of dollars going to Britain, while a British blockade meant that almost nothing was getting to Germany. So America's economy was getting more and more tied to an Allied victory.
And that so-called neutrality started to get tested by a series of events. First, in 1915, a German U-boat sinks the passenger ship Lusitania, and 128 Americans died. Germany then promised to back off, but by early 1917, they were getting desperate. They made a huge gamble and went back to unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning their U-boats would sink any ship heading to Britain.
But the final straw? Oh, this was a big one. British spies picked up this secret coded message from Germany to Mexico. It's called the Zimmermann telegram, and it proposed a military alliance against the United States.
Germany promised that if the U.S. got into the war, they would help Mexico reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. I mean, this was a direct threat to American soil, and when it hit the papers, people were absolutely furious.
So when you put it all together, Germany breaking its promises, the sinking of the Lusitania, the U-boats attacking everything, our deep economic ties with Britain, and then this Zimmerman note, well, war pretty much became inevitable. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany.
Okay, so America's in, but declaring war and actually being ready for a war are two totally different things. The U.S. was not prepared, and the entire country had to be mobilized on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
The federal government suddenly had all these new powers. The Selective Service Act drafted millions of men into the Army. The Food Administration had people observing Wheatless Wednesdays and Meatless Mondays to save food. The War Industries Board was literally telling factories what to build. It was a total transformation of American society.
But you gotta ask, with this massive national effort, what about the people who didn't support the war? What happened if you spoke out?
Well, the crackdown was intense. The Espionage and Sedition Acts basically made it a crime to criticize the war effort. A huge wave of anti-German hysteria swept the country. German Americans were targeted and harassed. And things got pretty absurd, like when people started calling sauerkraut Liberty cabbage and hamburgers Liberty steaks.
The arrival of all these fresh American soldiers, the doughboys as they were called, really helped tip the balance on the battlefield. And on November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed. The guns finally fell silent. But winning the war was one thing. Winning the peace was a whole different challenge.
See, President Wilson came to the peace conference in Paris with this grand, idealistic vision for a new world, his 14 points. But the European allies, they had very different ideas. This quote from the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau just says it all. After 4 years of absolute carnage, they wanted revenge, not some idealistic American peace without victory.
And this chart just shows the huge gap between Wilson's dream and what actually happened in the Treaty of Versailles. Instead of a fair peace, Germany was slapped with a war guilt clause, forced to pay billions in crippling reparations, and had its military dismantled. Wilson did get his Association of Nations, the League of Nations, but the harsh terms of the rest of the treaty planted seeds of deep, deep resentment in Germany. Which brings us to this final, really haunting question. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but the treaty that ended it created so much bitterness and humiliation. Did that flawed peace just pave the way for an even bigger, even more destructive war just 20 years later? That's a question historians are still fiercely debating today.